Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First this morning, the government is publishing the first of 8 bills that will pave the way for Britain's departure from the European Union. That's less than 21 months away now under Article 50, and there's lots of legislative work to do before then. The European Union Bill, known as the Repeal Bill, no longer great, is a key part of the government's Brexit strategy. It will repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, which took Britain into the EU, and remove the supremacy of Brussels law. Brexit Secretary David Davis said the bill is one of the most significant pieces of legislation that has ever passed through Parliament, and has asked MPs across the House to work together to deliver it. But Labour's shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, says in its current form, the bill gives ministers sweeping delegated powers, which would allow the government to alter legislation with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. The Labour Party says it'll vote against the legislation unless there are significant changes. The bill is not expected to be debated in the Commons or the Lords until the autumn, but it will need to be passed by the time the UK leaves the EU on the current timetable scheduled for March 2019. I'm joined now by David Jones, who was until recently a minister in the Department for Exiting the EU. Welcome to the programme. Now, Douglas Alexander, the majority of Labour MPs voted to trigger Article 50, which started this process. But an essential part of this process is this so-called repeal bill, and they're now threatening to vote against it. How does that work?
Because they accept the principle that Britain will leave the European Union, but they're not convinced by what, by David Davis's reckoning, is one of the most important pieces of legislation to come before the Commons in many decades. They're doing their job in making sure that they scrutinise this bill effectively and make sure it's the best possible bill given the circumstances the country finds itself in.
It's not trying to frustrate the Brexit process? I mean, if they were, they may not have the numbers, but if they were to vote this bill down, what would happen?
Well, it's ultimately in the government's hands. I mean, I think the Labour Party leadership has taken quite a lot of heat in recent months for not seeking to circumvent or to deny the vote that was cast on the 23rd of June last year, at the same time as saying there are significant changes that can and should be made to this bill. For example, the Henry VIII powers, the way devolution is treated. There are very significant principles embedded in this legislation which deserve to be scrutinised by Parliament.
It makes it a lot more difficult if you're going to face guerrilla war from the Labour Party now, doesn't it, given it's a hung parliament?
It does, and I think that the point is that the Labour Party supported the notification of withdrawal bill, which of course was the legislation that led to triggering Article 50, and having done that, I think that they've got a duty to act positively towards this bill and not seek to frustrate it. I think Douglas
but they're right to, I mean, their job as the opposition, their job is to scrutinise it, and they don't need to accept they may accept the principle. Did I heard a Labour spokesman this morning saying they do. But it's then their job, if the bits they don't like, they're perfectly entitled to vote against it.
Well, I'm not sure that Keir Starmer sounds as if he's accepting the principle at the moment. But I think moving beyond that, yes, of course we accept that the bill has got to be scrutinised. And I think that one of the most positive things recently was the House of Lords Constitution Committee report, which actually suggested a way forward in terms of scrutiny. I think that's a really good basis for going forward, having, for example, joint committees of both houses scrutinising the legislation before each clause is put forward, and I think that that's a really good basis for discussion.
The shadow Brexit minister has, quote, put the government on notice. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, still for a while, says the repeal bill will, quote, be hell. You must be glad you're not in that department anymore.
Well, there are compensations not being in the department.
This sounds like trench warfare, doesn't it?
I think that the comments of Tim Farron are really, frankly, ridiculous to suggest that the process is going to be hell. I fully accept that politicians on all sides are going to have to scrutinise this, and there'll be Conservative colleagues who want to do that too. But to talk in terms of, as he is effectively wrecking it, I think is very irresponsible.
Should Labour vote against the second reading of it? I mean, I can see why in committee or in, I don't know, it's going to be a separate committee or done on the floor of the House, that they will put lots of amendments and the things that they're entitled to vote against. But should they vote against the second reading?
I think that largely depends on what kind of commitments the ministers give in the course of the second reading debate. I think it's regrettable, frankly, the bill wasn't published in draft so that there could be pre-legislative scrutiny, because a lot of these issues could have been resolved if there was a pre-legislative draft produced. That scrutiny is now going to happen in the course of the passage in Parliament.
The government says it's ready to listen on Brexit. David Davis says MPs must work together. The Prime Minister keeps on asking the Labour Party for ideas and so on. But where has the government given concessions on this?
Well, we haven't seen the bill yet. The bill has not yet been published.
But the point is, it could have given concessions to incorporate it in the bill, and we have no indication that that's the case.
Well, as I say, so far the bill has not yet been published, but I mean, clearly the government have made it clear that they're very happy and indeed anxious to discuss the way forward with other parties. The Prime Minister couldn't have been clearer.
This issue of these so-called Henry VIII powers, which means that you can alter legislation, the government can, by a statutory instrument rather than legislation. I mean, you can see why people will be wary of that. On the other hand, we've only got to March 2019 to get all this stuff onto the British legal framework. I mean, surely there's really no other way of doing it. It's a massive bill.
My sense is there's no difficulty in incorporating many thousands of statutory instruments onto the statute so that we've got legal certainty moving beyond March the 29th. The question is, has the government in this bill given adequate assurance that there won't be a continuing capability for very significant pieces of legislation to be amended by statutory instrument, thereby, if you like, enabling not taking back control by Parliament, but actually a loss of parliamentary scrutiny.
Because the executive would
Because the executive, rather than the Parliament, has that ongoing power.
What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's very clear that the bill will have a sunset clause. In other words, those powers can't be exercised indefinitely. Again, I return to the suggestions of the House of Lords Constitution Committee, which is that we should have pre-legislative scrutiny, that the power should be exercised only on certain terms.
Right, well, I'm glad you brought up for the second time the Lords report on this, because they said the repeal bill will, quote, involve massive transfer of legislative competence from Parliament to government.
It could potentially.
Well, they said it will.
And that is why the scrutiny process is so important. The suggestion by the House of Lords Committee was that there should be joint committees looking at the legislation before it came through. And they also suggested constraining the powers by applying it only to the extent necessary to correct the British statute book and also to ensure that anything that was agreed during the negotiation process could also be incorporated. And I think that the government would be willing to listen to those proposals.
The head of the National Audit Office, an impartial, highly respected civil servant, he says the government's Brexit strategy is in danger, quote, of falling apart like a chocolate orange.
Well, actually, I would have thought a chocolate orange was a particularly well-engineered confectionery item.
Yeah, but it does tend to fall. He was comparing it to a cricket bat, which is rather more sturdy than a chocolate orange.
I read what he had to say, and having been in the department, I can confirm that DEXU, the Department for Exiting the European Union, is right across Whitehall on this, and I didn't recognise...
So why would he say that?
Well, frankly, I didn't recognise the criticisms he made, because it didn't reflect anything that I was aware of when I was there.
The Labour Party, Douglas Alexander, now says it wants to incorporate the European Charter of Fundamental Rights into UK law, not the European Court based in Strasbourg, but the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Yet this was the charter which, in power, Labour said would have no more significance than the Beano and wouldn't really involve Britain. And yet you now want to write it into UK law. Why?
My understanding is that Keir has included that as a request from the Labour Party at the outset.
That's why I'm raising it.
Because, first of all, it has taken on a greater significance in terms of a modern expression of both social and employment rights within Europe than may have been anticipated at the time of your initial comments. But also his policy concern is to make sure that we don't see a degradation of employment and social and human rights as a consequence of the acquis being written into the British statute.
Surely that's a matter that now for Parliament, if Parliament or under, say, this government, it was to start to erode workers' rights, then Labour would surely fight the next election saying this is an outrage, we're going to reverse that and get elected on that basis. But why do you need a European Charter once described as the
Because Labour MPs were elected to this Parliament on a mandate not of a great repeal bill, but a bill that would guarantee all of those human, social and employment rights.
But why do we need a European Charter to do that? Are we not capable? We already have the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights based in Strasbourg, and we remain under that jurisdiction. And I think even the Conservatives have said that ain't going to change. Parliament becomes sovereign in these matters. We elect Parliament. Why do we need a European Charter?
For example, you've already had Philip Hammond, an increasingly influential Chancellor of the Exchequer, threatening the spectre of a kind of North Atlantic Singapore, where employment rights, for example, would be reduced as a consequence of a changed economic model.
That would be a matter of democratic... If the country voted to go that way, fine, and in the unlikely event, I would suggest, if it doesn't, you can stop that.
But the country has voted for Labour MPs to go that way.
Why give all this power to lawyers? You don't trust politicians?
Well, ultimately, Parliament is the forum in which these matters are going to be determined, and Keir Starmer's doing his job.
Well, the Charter of Fundamental Rights is, in effect, a signposting measure, and it refers to underlying rights. Now, those underlying rights will not be affected in any way by this legislation. They will remain there. And repeatedly, ministers in this government have given assurances that there will be no degradation, no erosion of workers' rights.
OK. So you think it would be wrong to include this European Charter?
I think it's unnecessary for the reasons you've actually just given.
All right, we shall see. And we'll see whether it's a red line, or it'll be interesting on that.
Well, we are going to be talking about the Great Repeal Bill, not the official name for what the government have introduced today. There'll be some fairly cursory discussion of that bill tomorrow, but the substantive debate won't begin until the autumn. Tim Farron, the Liberal Democrat leader, has talked about giving it a hellish reception. We're going to be talking to Hilary Benn, the chairman of the Brexit Select Committee, very shortly about what he thinks the kind of reception, line by line, that it is likely to get.
Yeah, well, the official name for the bill, as Colin was mentioning, has been changed quite a few times. The official name is now the European Union Withdrawal Bill. As I mentioned, that was published in the House of Commons earlier today. David Davis hoping and calling on opposition parties to get behind him and push this bill forward. However, we have already had Nicola Sturgeon and Carwyn Jones, the Labour leader, or the head of Labour in Wales, coming out and saying they won't be backing the bill because of devolved and devolution powers that they have, and they have issues with that. So they are already saying they're going to stand in the way of that.
Well, let's get more then on the government's plans for a Brexit repeal bill. As we say, not exactly the terminology that's been used now. We can talk to the chair of Parliament's Brexit Committee, Hilary Benn, who joins us. Hilary Benn, very good afternoon to you, and thanks for your patience. I know we had some technical problems down there at Westminster where you are. Tim Farron has promised to give this bill a hellish response. What will Labour's view be on it?
Well, Keir Starmer, who is our spokesperson on exiting the EU, has said that the bill is deficient in a number of respects, and the government needs to show that it's going to listen to the concerns that have been expressed. For example, ministers are proposing to take absolutely sweeping powers to change laws, including for up to 2 years after we leave the European Union. They're not proposing to read across the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is very important for the way in which labour rights and some others are interpreted in the law. There's a question about powers coming back to the devolved assemblies. And I think the essential point is this. The election changed the parliamentary arithmetic. The government, I'm sorry to say, at every stage has had to be poked and prodded into taking Parliament's role seriously. And Parliament has a very important job to do to make sure that we get this legislation right. And the government has to demonstrate that it's going to listen to the concerns that it's going to hear, I think, from all sides of the House of Commons.
What would you rather have instead of those Henry VIII powers? I mean, the government said there will be sunset clauses, they will expire. And when you've got 12,000 items of legislation, having that kind of ability to quickly nod through and transpose legislation is essential. What would be the alternative?
No, I do accept, I think we all accept, that there needs to be a system that can work to transpose all of this legislation so that the day after we leave, people are facing the same regulations and laws and certainty as they were the day before we left. But there's the world of difference between moving a regulation across where you just delete the word the Commission and substitute the Secretary of State for the Environment or whatever it is, and taking fundamental decisions, for example, air quality legislation. Now, we have on our statute book laws which say that we need to meet certain air quality standards to protect people walking the streets, breathing fumes that do them a lot of harm and cause a lot of respiratory illness and some deaths. Now, to whom is that going to be given, that responsibility in the United Kingdom after we've left? What will be the remedy? At the moment, people could go to the European Court of Justice, but in future, how will you enforce those rights? Now, those are not minor changes to read legislation across. They're really quite fundamental decisions. Another example would be setting up brand new bodies to take on functions that have been carried out for us over a number of years by European organisations, and we don't have such a body in the UK at the moment. So those are big questions of policy, and we have to find a mechanism that Parliament, all sides of Parliament, are comfortable with, that enables the right degree of scrutiny depending on the seriousness and import of the decision that's being made.
But surely it is not an alternative to go through every single line of legislation that's been passed since 1972 and redraft every single item of legislation.
No, but that is not the case. If you're talking about legislation that derives from EU directives, they have already been implemented in UK law. We're talking here about regulations and decisions of the Commission which have direct legal effect in the United Kingdom currently, won't have direct legal effect after we have left, and therefore you have to find a way of transposing them. I think what you need is some kind of sifting mechanism, so Parliament can say, well, that and that's pretty straightforward. These things, we need to look at this in a bit more detail. And I think the plea that's being made on behalf of all parliamentarians to the government is, you need to listen. And one of the difficulties we have is that we proposed as the Select Committee in the last Parliament that the government should have published this bill in draft. And if they'd done that, then we would have had a chance to raise a lot of these points, and the government could have taken it into account in publishing the final version of the bill. They chose not to do that. So the first time we saw the bill was about, an hour and a half ago, and they should not be surprised if people looking at it say, well, we're not quite happy with this, and you need to make some changes here. And there will be other examples. The row about our membership of Euratom at the moment, it's pretty clear that there are a lot of MPs, including some on the Conservative side, who think it's a profound mistake to say we're going to withdraw from the Euratom Treaty. And it may well be that amendments are moved to the bill to try and put that right as it passes through the House of Commons. So this is probably the most significant piece of legislation we've faced in Parliament for decades, and therefore Parliament needs to do its job, and we need to get it right. And the government, instead of complaining about people raising concerns, needs to recognise it's time to start listening.
Hilary Benn, thanks very much. Let's bring in Dr. Andrew Blick, a constitutional historian from King's College London. Andrew, welcome to you. We won't really get to debate this, won't see this debated until the autumn now, but we've got the publication. Labour are exercised by a number of things, including, we're told, the fact that the Charter of Fundamental Rights has not been included. Are they right to be exercised by that?
Yeah, the Charter of Fundamental Rights has been expressly excluded. I've got the bill here by clause 5 of the bill, which as it has appeared. So we're being told it will not be part of UK law. Labour have already previously said that for them this will be a critical issue. So this will give them a basis on which to disagree with the bill and oppose it in Parliament.
Yeah, I know when I was in Brussels, I remember interviewing a former Labour Europe minister who was talking about the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and he said it would have less legal weight than the Beano. So things have changed.
Well, indeed, some people do say it doesn't make that much difference, and at the time when we signed up to it, we were almost saying it won't make any difference. On the other hand, you could argue, if it's not making any difference, what's the harm in keeping it in UK law?
In terms of the Henry VIII powers, explain what they are, and again, why the government favours them, but the critics have their suspicions.
Henry VIII powers are powers under which ministers can make legislation themselves. They don't have to go through the full parliamentary process that they would have to go through for a full Act of Parliament. There may be some parliamentary process, but it's not the full kind of scrutiny and approval that you would get with a complete Act of Parliament. They're used in order to enable ministers to act flexibly and change the law where necessary. The question is, what kind of scrutiny are they subject to? In creating them, are we giving ministers excessive discretionary powers? Are we giving them too much unaccountable power? Should we be creating special safeguards to ensure that these powers aren't abused and used in a way that we didn't expect they might be, or we couldn't predict they would be, or we didn't want them to be when we first passed this enabling legislation?
Yeah, I mean, the government says this is about expediency. This is about that there are sunset clauses, 2 years, these powers will expire, and then conventional parliamentary practice will reapply. I suppose a lot of people will say, well, they've got a point, haven't they? When you've got this much on the statute books, which in a very short period of time has to be dumped out of Brussels into Westminster, you've got to move quickly. There isn't the time to go line by line through all that legislation again.
Yes, indeed, and I think most parties accept there will be some kind of need for flexibility. The question is how much? How is it controlled? And of course, there'll be a big temptation for opposition parties to look for things that they can criticise, to be seen to be broadly supporting Brexit, going along with the referendum result, while at the same time finding principled objections through which they can make difficulties for the government. So there'll be lots of complications in there, but it is certainly a long-standing sensitivity in Parliament about Henry VIII clauses, about subordinate powers which can be used to alter primary legislation. And Parliament is always very sensitive about creating these powers because they could actually reduce its own scope for influence further down the line. Because the temptation is, presumably, Andrew, you know, I don't know, you've got a law governing the way cycling lanes work. It's currently enshrined under European law. You're turning it into a Westminster law. The danger is that it can't be brought over exactly verbatim, line by line. And in the act of transposing, if you've got these Henry VIII powers, suddenly the temptation might be, if you're sitting in government doing the drafting, to actually make it something a bit more like what you want to see. So you inject some politics into the legal redrafting. Exactly. When people say they're going to transfer something straightforwardly, there's always a temptation, and clearly it's always possible to interpret things, perhaps entirely innocently, different to the way that someone else may interpret them. But there's always this temptation in Whitehall to do that. And we've seen historically that when we were members of the EU, sometimes when legislation was introduced on a basis that it was being required by the European Union, often extra things would be added on top as it went through Whitehall that weren't necessarily actually required by the European Union because they were things that the government of the day wanted to do.
Tim Farron has said that this bill will get a hellish reception. This could really drag on.
It could drag on, but then how much time do we really have is a difficult question. We know that as things currently stand, we are out of the European Union March 2019, whatever else happens. How much time does the government have? And added to that, we've got the complication that we don't know exactly what course the negotiations are going to take, and there'll be extra constraints possibly introduced on the government as a course of whatever agreement they can or cannot reach.
As Michelle Barnier reminded us only yesterday, the clock is ticking. Dr. Andrew Blick, thanks very much indeed.
It's another major step on Britain's path to leaving the European Union. The government has finally published its long-awaited plans to pave the way for EU law to be transferred into British law. The European Union Withdrawal Bill is being described as one of the largest legal projects ever undertaken in the UK. The government's called for all parties to work together to make it a success, but already Labour is calling for significant changes, and the Liberal Democrats are warning they will make life hell for the government. The bill will take an estimated 12,000 EU laws and copy them into UK law on the day that the UK leaves the European Union. The government will then have powers to amend laws as it sees fit. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg has this report, a warning it contains some flashing images.
Has nothing changed? Still doing the handshakes? Rolling out the red carpet for royalty, Spanish this time? Still embarking on the task of taking us out of the European Union? No, everything's changed. For the first time today, the Prime Minister explaining her shock at the election.
I felt, I suppose, devastated really, because as I say, I knew the campaign wasn't going perfectly, but still the messages I was getting from people I was speaking to, but also the comments we were getting back from a lot of people that were being passed on to me, were that we were going to get a better result than we did.
Devastated enough to shed a tear?
Yes, a little tear.
Yes. At that moment, that private moment?
At that moment, yes.
And then you obviously have to just brush yourself down.
You have a responsibility that, you know, you're a human being, you've been through that experience, but I was, you know, there as leader of the party and Prime Minister, and I had a responsibility then to, as we went through the night, to determine what we were going to do the next morning.
Presentation of bill.
It won't get any easier. Today, the bill that will legally take us out of the European Union arrived in Parliament. Broadly, the withdrawal bill cuts and pastes thousands of EU laws that govern so much right now into British law. Once we leave, they won't apply. But with Theresa May's shaky grip, MPs will inevitably try to make big changes.
I think there is a big understanding now amongst ministers right the way across the board that there will need to be compromises, there will need to be inevitable changes.
So you think ministers have understood that, but perhaps not yet Theresa May?
I think we will wait to see.
The withdrawal bill's such a huge undertaking. It also gives ministers the power to try to change or strike out swathes of regulation without guaranteeing MPs a say.
This bill, as it stands, though, would give ministers like you sweeping powers to change, get rid of bits and pieces of regulation that you don't like, without MPs having a guaranteed vote and full debate.
Understand. These are hardly massive changes. These are technical changes to make the law work. And it's up to the House of Commons. If a statutory instrument is placed in front of the House of Commons decides whether it debates it and votes on it.
But they're not guaranteed votes, unless today you want to give them a guarantee of vote. I mean, this is
that's in the call of the House of Commons, what it chooses to vote on and so on. But no, it's not just a ministerial signature. It is what they call a statutory instrument, which can be debated and can be voted on.
Morning all. On our way.
Labour is making its own way.
You enjoyed it?
Asking for its own meetings in Brussels, trying to get the EU's negotiator on side.
A football shirt. Barnier.
No.
You're now playing for Arsenal.
Although it might take more than an Arsenal shirt to do that. But there's no way, as it stands, Labour will back this bill.
We will make sure there is full parliamentary scrutiny. That has to be key to it. We have a parliament where the government doesn't have a majority. We have a country that has voted in two ways on leave and remain. Obviously the majority voted to leave. We respect that, but they didn't vote to lose jobs. They didn't vote to have Parliament ridden roughshod over.
Nor will the Scottish Government. Nicola Sturgeon with her own Kodak moment in Brussels today too. The Scottish Parliament can't technically veto the plan, but it can refuse willing consent.
As the bill stands just now, I could in good conscience recommend to the Scottish Parliament that it gives legislative consent to this bill. This bill takes powers away from the Scottish Parliament and undermines the very foundations of the devolution settlement that Parliament is built on.
As Whitehall begins this enormous process, ministers are all too well aware there will be conflict ahead. The question, how they balance compromise and hang on to their credibility.
And what ends up on the statute books doesn't just sit on the shelf, but shapes how ministers govern, how we live our lives.
And Laura is in Westminster now, so certainly a challenging path ahead for the government.
Yeah, absolutely, Sophie. I think ministers are all too well aware that their chances of getting this through without having to make concessions are slim to none. The political decision is, of course, when do they start compromising and in what areas are they prepared to budge? But, you know, on some parts of this huge undertaking, there is a bit of an air of flexibility around. David Davis also suggested to me that the government might pursue associate membership of Euratom. Now, that is the nuclear safety body that we're part of as part of being in the European Union, and he suggested, with rumours and rumblings about a rebellion in the air, that we might look at some kind of association way of staying in. He also suggested what he called arbitration mechanisms. Now, jargon for potentially panels of judges from around Europe and maybe Britain too, a way of getting around the very difficult problem where Britain wants its judges to be in charge of everything and Brussels wants European judges to be in charge of everything. So there are some areas where we are starting to see the government bend a little bit. Why is that? Because they know they have to. They are up against the clock. It's ticking louder and louder. And of course, since the election, their authority has taken a knock.
Laura, thank you.
The Prime Minister marked a year in the job today by admitting she shed a little tear on election night. Might there be more of those to come, though, over legislation introduced to Parliament today? The hugely significant repeal bill seeks to import thousands of elements of EU law, largely wholesale, into UK law in order to smooth our exit from the EU. But with the intrinsic weakness of a hung Parliament and the opposition promising it will be hell to get through, Mrs May faces an uphill struggle. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports from Westminster.
Today's bill will repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, which took Britain into the then common market 44 years ago. And it'll overturn the supremacy of European law, which Ted Heath signed up to then on Britain's behalf.
Presentation of Bill. Mr. Secretary Davis, Mr. Minister Baker.
Today's symbolic first reading, as usual, lasted just a few seconds, even for this, one of the most important bills in Westminster history.
What it does is take the law that exists now and will exist on, as well, on the day before we leave the Union, and make sure that same law is in place the day after. That's the certainty it gives, and it then allows Parliament to change that through what they call primary legislation, Acts of Parliament.
These sealed rooms above Parliament hold legislation dating back to medieval times. Yet for 44 years, we've been subject also to laws and regulations from Europe. Today's bill will transfer an estimated 12,000 EU regulations overnight into British law. Nearly two-thirds of them regulations that were brought in since Britain joined the community back in 1973. But the nation's goats and sheep can breathe a collective bleat of relief. The government is not planning to write out all the regulations one by one on vellum in the way they normally do with parliamentary acts. Instead, they plan to publish it all online. Here's the act from Henry VIII's time, which scrapped any right for English people to appeal above the crown to the Pope in Rome.
And it says that it's the realm of England will now be governed by one supreme God and King.
So it was a sort of repeal bill of its day.
Indeed, yes.
And today's bill similarly ends any future say on these shores for the European Court of Justice.
Hello.
Labour leaders visited the EU Brexit negotiator in Brussels today and gave him an Arsenal shirt.
Barnier? No. You're now playing for Arsenal.
Strange, given their record in Europe.
Monsieur Wenger will manage.
Opposition parties think this bill gives ministers too much power to sort out any problems in the 2 years after EU law becomes British law, with too little scrutiny by MPs.
But there are serious flaws with the repeal bill as it's currently proposed. In particular, it's got sweeping powers by delegated legislation. Essentially, anything that happens after the repeal bill gets royal assent is going to be dealt with by delegated legislation. That's far, far too wide.
And the Scottish and Welsh nationalists, also in Brussels today, say London will grab powers returned from Europe which should be devolved to Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast.
So it is a power grab. It seems to be an attack on the very foundations of the devolution settlement. And that's not just my view. My response today has been issued jointly with the First Minister of Wales.
Today, the government also confirmed Britain will leave Euratom, the atomic energy community, despite fears about safety and possible shortages of radioactive isotopes needed in medicine. Ministers say they'll negotiate a new regime of cooperation and safeguards.
Even the person who ran the Leave campaign says it is ridiculous to say that we should leave Euratom. The government
own position is, well, we've got to leave it, but we want to keep everything exactly as it is. And I wouldn't be surprised if an amendment is put down by somebody saying, actually, we're going to stay in the Euratom Treaty, which is important for nuclear issues and the free movement of scientists and radiotherapies that people rely on in the NHS. And it'd be very interesting to see how the House of Commons votes.
And the bill could be substantially amended in many other ways. With no government majority in either Commons or Lords, its passage could be very rocky.
Yeah, it's not been an easy birthday for Theresa May today. I doubt whether her husband Philip will be giving her a chocolate orange after very strong remarks overnight by the head of the National Audit Office, Sir Amias Morse, about the lack of coordination in government as far as he can see when it comes to Brexit. He said that in terms of the government plan, what we don't want to find is that at the first tap it falls apart like a chocolate orange. Also, that is on the same day that another independent government agency, the Office for Budget Responsibility, has warned that the uncertain trading future for this country could threaten growth and future revenues, Treasury revenues. They argue that even if productivity growth declines, say, by only 0.1% over a period of 50 years, that could mean a 5% almost decline in the size of the economy.
Michael Crick, thank you very much. Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP for Chelmsford, Vicky Ford, and I began by asking her, with the opposition and Welsh and Scottish First Ministers threatening to derail the flagship Brexit bill, can the government actually deliver on leaving the EU?
Well, I think it's extremely irresponsible to try and derail this bill. This bill is a technical bill which will take all existing European law into British law so that there is certainty and stability for all the businesses that are affected by European law. And that is the technical issue that one needs to give the economy stability. This is not trying to change the underlying European law. Any changes would need full new primary legislation and scrutiny. So we do need to make sure that this happens. It was part of the whole Brexit process, and it needs to be done very smoothly and with great detail.
Britain is facing its most serious peacetime challenge. Do you think this government's up to it?
It is a very serious peacetime challenge, and that is precisely why the government has today announced the detail of this great repeal bill. We know that will be complicated, but we need to give stability and certainty both to British companies and to our European neighbours across the sea to make sure that they see that we don't intend to tear up decades of European law in this process, but actually we want to continue with a smooth transition and work together.
Michel Barnier has said frictionless trade is not possible. If we're not in the single market, we cannot get the exact same benefits. Do you understand that?
Well, Michel, I do understand that because I have chaired the Single Market Committee in Brussels. Michel Barnier has also said that it is very important that if we want to have deep access to the single market going forward, that we have common and strong regulatory standards. And that is precisely what this Great Repeal Bill is doing by taking the current European law into British law and making it very clear that we intend to start day one exactly the same. It means that that will give more confidence into our future trade deal.
But the clock is ticking. Aren't you afraid we're going to run out of time?
Well, that is precisely why it is so important that we get on with this now and that we don't try and derail it. And if the opposition have got concerns, that we deal with that in a responsible manner and don't just walk away from the table without even being prepared to talk about it. This is complicated and everybody should roll up their sleeves and get on with the job.
Vicky Ward, thank you very much for joining us.
I've been getting away with it all